Hey world history, how you guys doing? Today we are going to talk about Napoleon and what happened when he came to power and the age of Napoleon, which is about a 16-year period that really covers most of Europe because he has a pretty big impact. So, from 1799 to 1815, Napoleon Bonaparte would dominate France and Europe. He was a hero to some, he was evil to others, but he did give his name to the final phase of the age of the French Revolution, the age of Napoleon. So he was born in Corsica, which was a French-ruled island in the Mediterranean. At age 9, he was sent to France to be trained for a military career. When the revolution broke out, he was 20, and he was very much ready to make a name for himself. Napoleon favored the Jacobins. He favored the Republican rule. However, he found the conflicting ideas and personalities of the French Revolution confusing, as most do. He wrote to his brother, "Since one must take sides, one might as well choose the side that is victorious, the side which devastates, loots, and burns. Considering the alternative, it is better to eat than be eaten." So he picked a side not necessarily because of who he believed in, but who seemed to be doing the best. Now, during the turmoil of the revolution, Napoleon rises very quickly in the army. In December of 1793, he drives the British forces out of the French port of Toulon. He then went on to win several victories against the Austrians, captured a lot of northern Italy, forced the Habsburgs to make peace, and he hoped to disrupt the British trade with India, so he led an expedition to Egypt in 1798. The Egyptian campaign proved to be a disaster, but he managed to not really tell too many people about it, and he managed to keep it kind of on the DL. He did so by establishing a network of spies and censoring the press. So basically, he wouldn't let anybody talk about how badly he lost. Success fuels his ambition. By 1799, he moves from victorious general to political leader. Then he helped overthrow the Directory. He set up a 3-man governing board known as the Consulate, which you might recall from Roman history. Another constitution was drawn up, but he took the title First Consul, and by 1802, he changed the law to name himself Consul for life. Not an elected position. Okay, so Napoleon started as a war hero. And then he sets up the consulate, and then he becomes first consul, which leads to consul for life. And then, 2 years later, Napoleon had acquired enough power to assume the title Emperor. He invited the Pope to preside over his coronation. However, in the time, he took the crown he didn't let the Pope put the crown on his head. He took the crown from the Pope, put it on his own head, basically saying, "I put myself here." At each step on his rise to power, he did hold a vote called a plebiscite, which is a popular vote by ballot. Each time, the French strongly supported him because people had a say. They were voting, so they felt like they still had a say. Now, of course, he's in absolute power. This is called democratic despotism. To understand why people supported him, let's talk about his policies. So during the consulate and his empire, I guess consul for life, then emperor. So during the consulate and his rule as emperor, Napoleon consolidated his power by strengthening the central government. Order, security, and efficiency created the original liberty, equality, and fraternity as slogans of the new regime. He restored economic prosperity. He controlled prices. He encouraged new industries. He built roads and canals. He set up a system of public schools. He set up a training system for officers and military officials. At the same time, he backed off from some of the revolution's social reforms. He made peace with the Catholic Church in 1801 with a concordat of 1801. The concordat kept the church under state control, but recognized some religious freedoms, and so people were less mad. Revolutionaries who opposed the church were mad about it, but Catholics were happy. He also wins support across class lines. He asks the emigres to return. Now, he does ask that they take an oath of loyalty, but he asks them to come back. Peasants were relieved when he recognized their right to the lands that they bought from the church and the nobles. The middle class benefited the most from the revolution, and they approved of Napoleon's economic reforms and restoration of order. He opens jobs to all based on talent, which was a popular policy among those who remembered what it was like when jobs were based on birthright. And among his most lasting reforms was a new code of laws, popularly called the Napoleonic Code. It embodied Enlightenment principles, such as the equality of all citizens before the law, religious toleration, the abolishment of feudalism. But it did undo some reforms. So, for example, it oppressed women. Again, they lost a lot of their newly gained rights and could not exercise their right to citizenship. Male heads of the household regained complete authority over their wives and children. because Napoleon valued order over individual rights. So you can see why he's becoming popular. He's recognizing people's claims to land. He's saying you're all equal. And so his reforms are usually very popular. From 1804 to 1812, Napoleon furthered his reputation on the battlefield because, remember, France is still at war. He takes great risks. He suffers some huge losses, but he managed to conquer a lot of Europe. And you'll see that in your Junipod after this. Napoleon's power in Europe by 1812 was very great. He was a military leader. He valued rapid movements. He made effective use of his large armies. He developed new plans, and he kept developing new plans, so opposing generals couldn't rely on patterns. They couldn't say, well, Napoleon did this last year, so maybe he'll do it again. Didn't work. Napoleon's presence on the battlefield, he was such a brilliant leader on the battlefield, and he redrew the map of Europe. He creates this vast French empire. He annexes or incorporates the Netherlands, Belgium, parts of Italy, parts of Germany. He abolished the Holy Roman Empire for good and creates a 38-member Confederation of the Rhine, which is under French protection. He cuts Prussian territory in half. He turns part of old Poland into something he called the Grand Duchy of Warsaw. And he controls a lot of it through forceful diplomacy. So one tactic is keeping his friends and his relatives on the thrones of Europe. For example, after he unseated the King of Spain, he put his own brother on the throne as the new King of Spain, Joseph Bonaparte. He also forced alliances with European powers all the way from Madrid to Moscow. At various times, the rulers of Austria, Prussia, and Russia reluctantly signed treaties with him because they called him the Corsican ogre because he kept winning. In France, his successes boosted the spirit of nationalism. They're saying, look at what Napoleon has gained for France. He's quite literally taken over half of Europe. And if you look at the map on page 595, which you will later in your Junipod, you see how much territory that he's gained. Everything in purple and red were allied with or dependent upon Napoleon. Then he struck at Britain, and Britain alone, of all the major European powers, remained outside of Napoleon's European empire. Britain had a small army, but they had a lot of sea power, and being an island, sometimes that's all you need. In 1805, Napoleon prepares to invade England, but at the Battle of Trafalgar, which was fought off the southwestern coast of Spain, the British Admiral Horatio Nelson destroyed the French fleet, and Horatio Nelson is still hailed as a hero. So therefore they couldn't invade, right? Their naval power wasn't enough. So then Napoleon struck at Britain's commerce instead. So he wages economic warfare through the continental system, where he basically said, none of the countries that I have control of are going to trade with Britain. This is a huge hit to the British economy, which requires on trading. It's kind of like Disney World being shut down. Florida is going to take an economic hit because we don't have the tourism from Disney World. Now, that's what Napoleon's doing to Great Britain. He's not allowing them to trade, and trade was their biggest thing. He couldn't stop them from trading, but he could stop all the countries he controlled from buying stuff from them. And so then he also sets up a blockade, which shuts off ports. And during their long struggle, both Britain and France start seizing neutral ships. Britain starts attacking American ships and actually triggers the War of 1812 because of their attacks on American ships and their desperation for new soldiers. So they would start kidnapping and forcing people on American boats to serve in their army. In the end, Napoleon's continental system failed to bring Britain to its knees. Although Britain's exports did decline and its economy was hurt, the powerful navy kept enough trade routes open, particularly to the Americas and to India, neither of which Napoleon controlled. And so he couldn't stop them trading there. And so Britain did not surrender to Napoleon. Meanwhile, trade restrictions, though, created a scarcity of goods in Europe, which made people angry because now they can't get the stuff they're used to getting from Great Britain. And so people are starting to resist Napoleon. French armies under Napoleon start to spread ideas of the revolution across Europe. They back liberal reforms. They try to abolish titles of nobility. The Napoleonic Code starts becoming law all around Europe, which not everybody's very happy with. And so that kind of leads to some of the challenges Napoleon faces. So he's had a lot of successes. He's had economic successes, he's had political success, legal success, and military success. But now let's talk about some of his challenges, okay? So in 1812, Napoleon continued his pursuit of world domination because he wanted to rule the world. That was his goal. And so he invaded Russia. This campaign begins a chain of events that will eventually lead to his downfall. Don't invade Russia. Didn't work for Napoleon. Didn't work for Hitler. Don't do it. Napoleon's final defeat brought an end to the era of the French Revolution. So one thing that worked against him, that had worked for him for so long, was nationalism. Napoleon's successes contain seeds of defeat because nationalism is spurring the French armies to success, but it starts to work against them. A lot of Europeans that he conquered, like other nations, see the ideas of the French Revolution and Napoleon as foreign oppressors. They're saying, we don't want to be French. We don't want your nationalism. And so from Rome to Madrid to the Netherlands, nationalism unleashes revolt against the French. In German states, the leaders encourage loyalty among German-speaking people. They're saying, listen, okay, yes, you're powerful and yes, you're strong, but we don't want to be French. We're our own people. And so it's starting to work against him in his conquests. Then, of course, there's resistance to foreign rule, particularly in Spain and Austria. A lot of Spaniards remained loyal to the king that Napoleon had ousted. And they also remained devoted to the church. Remember, Spain's always Catholic. If there's one thing that you can rely on Spain with, they're always Catholic. And so when the Spanish resisted, well-armed French forces responded with this brutal repression. And so far from crushing the resistance, though, it actually inflamed Spanish nationalism. So now the Spaniards are saying, oh, well, now you're being even meaner to us. We're going to fight back even harder. Okay, so let's write down some of these challenges. So nationalism. Spain and Austria. Of course, he can't defeat Britain. Okay, so Spanish resistance encourages the Austrians to resume hostilities. And so at the Battle of Austerlitz, Napoleon had originally won a crushing victory, but in 1809, the Austrians seek revenge. Napoleon did triumph again at the Battle of Wagram, but the peace agreement that followed, Austria had to surrender lands populated by more than 3 million subjects. Those are all people who are not going to be happy with the French. Then, though, Napoleon's still fighting in Russia, but he runs into a problem. He's there too long, and the seasons start to change. Tsar Alexander I of Russia was once an ally of Napoleon. The Tsar and Napoleon had been working together. They wanted to divide Europe. Basically, Alexander said, okay, I'll help you, and then when this is all over, we'll split Europe in half and each rule parts of it. Many countries objected, and Russia became unhappy with the economic effects of the system that he'd originally backed. Another cause for concern was that Napoleon had enlarged the Grand Duchy of Warsaw, which is Poland, and it was starting to cut into Russian lands, which wasn't fair. He was saying, hang on a sec, I thought we were supposed to be divvying this up, not you taking out pieces of my country. So these led the Tsar to withdraw his support. Napoleon responded and said, cool. You don't want to support me anymore? I'm going to assemble an army with soldiers from 20 different nations, and I'm going to invade you. In 1812, with 600,000 soldiers and 50,000 horses, Napoleon invades Russia. To avoid battle with Napoleon, the Russians retreated, and they burned crops and villages of their own land as they went. Why? Because if your crops and your villages are gone, the people are leaving, they're burning their stuff, then Napoleon doesn't have anywhere to stay and doesn't have any food to feed his soldiers. This is called scorched earth policy. And it leaves the French hungry, and it starts to leave them cold. They have no shelter, and winter's coming. Napoleon entered Moscow in September, but he realized that come winter, he was not going to be able to feed and clothe his army appropriately. They're from France. Russia's a whole different kettle of fish. And so in October, before winter really starts to get bad, he turns and retreats homeward. It's a 1,000-mile retreat, and it turns into a desperate battle for survival. Because Russians know how to survive the Russian winter. And Napoleon does not. So while they're trying to leave, the Russians are able to launch attacks, kind of hit and run, like the Spanish had earlier, start this tactic of guerrilla warfare. And so it's a lot of ambushes. The Russians are following them, and fewer than 20,000 soldiers of the 600,000 soldiers survived. Many died. A lot of them also deserted. The French general said General Famine and General Winter have conquered the Grand Army. It wasn't the Russians. It was starvation and it was cold. So Napoleon then rushed to France, desperate to try and regain his reputation for success because he had just failed very, very badly. And so now his reputation is starting to fall. And the disaster brings a new alliance. Russia now allies themselves with Britain, with Austria, and with Prussia because France is getting weaker, and they actually win a victory at Leipzig in modern-day Germany. The next year, Napoleon abdicates. He steps down from power. The victors exile him to an island called Elba, an island in the Mediterranean. Then they recognize Louis XVIII as king of France. They say, you know what? We need a new king. The restoration of Louis XVIII, though, didn't go smoothly. He had originally agreed to accept the Napoleonic Code, so the whole everybody's equal before the law, like we get to vote on stuff type thing. But many emigres rushed back to France bent on revenge, and so an economic depression and a fear of return to the old ways, because people were now worried. They're like, wait a second, we don't want a tyrant again. We don't want a king who's going to restore the nobility. And so now people are saying, wait a second, we kind of want Napoleon back now. And so as the victorious allies gather in Vienna for a peace conference, Napoleon escapes his island exile and returns to France. And people who missed him flock to help him out. As citizens cheer Napoleon, Louis XVIII flees the nation. And in 1815, Napoleon enters Paris being cheered for. But his triumph is short-lived. His star soared for only 100 days while the Allies reassembled their forces. June 18th, 1815, the opposing armies met near the town of Waterloo in Belgium. British forces under the Duke of Wellington and a Prussian army commanded by a guy named General Blücher crushed the French in a day-long battle. Once again, Napoleon is forced to abdicate and go into exile, and this time he does not come back. He knows his time is over. He has been defeated. But what's his legacy? He dies 6 years later in 1821, but his legend lives on in France and around the world. Was he the revolution, or was he a traitor to it? Nobody questions the fact that he was incredibly impactful on France and in Europe. The Napoleonic Code consolidated a lot of changes from the revolution. The France of Napoleon was a centralized state. It had a constitution. You had elections. Granted, the elections didn't always mean anything, but you had elections, and so people were happy. Many more citizens had the right to property. They had access to education. But French citizens did lose a lot of rights under Napoleon as well. On the world stage, Napoleon's conquests spread the ideas of the revolution. He failed to make Europe into a French empire, aka he didn't conquer the world. But he sparked nationalist feelings across Europe. They thought, well, if the French can be that proud of themselves, then we can be this proud of ourselves. The abolition of the Holy Roman Empire would eventually lead to the creation of Germany. Napoleon's impact also reached across the Atlantic, and in 1803, he sold France's Louisiana territory to the American government, which doubled the size of America at the time. But after Waterloo, you have some diplomats and heads of state who say, hang on, we don't want this to happen again. And they meet at what's called the Congress of Vienna. The Congress met for 10 months, from 1814 to 1815. It was a brilliant gathering. Diplomats, royalties, they dined and they danced and they attended concerts and balls. Their host was Emperor Francis I of Austria. The work fell to Prince Clemens von Metternich of Austria, Tsar Alexander I of Russia, and Lord Robert Casterlet of Britain. Defeated France was represented by Prince Talleyrand. So the Congress, though, what's the goal? You've got Russia, you've got Prussia, you've got Germany, you've got Austria, you've got France and Britain. What's the goal? The goal was to create lasting peace by establishing a balance of power, but also to protect the system of the monarchy. These monarchs do not want democracy. Each of the leaders also pursued their own goals. So Metternich, the Austrian, the dominant figure, wanted to restore things the way they were all the way back in 1792. Alexander I wanted a holy alliance of Christian monarchs to suppress future revolutions. So if anybody rebelled in somebody's country, people from the other countries would go help out. Talleyrand played everyone against each other to make sure that France was accepted. Because if they all had ganged up on France, then France never would have been accepted as a European power. But Talleyrand made sure that he played them all against each other so that they would listen to him and view France as a world power again. The peacemakers also very much redrew the map of Europe. To contain French ambitions, they ringed France with strong countries. In the north, they added Belgium and Luxembourg to Holland to create the Kingdom of the Netherlands. To prevent French expansion eastward, they gave Prussia lands along the Rhine River. They also allowed Austria to reassert control over northern Italy. So basically, they're ringing France with nations that are strong enough that France couldn't defeat them if France decided to go crazy again. To turn back the clock, the architects of the peace promoted the principle of legitimacy, which restores the hereditary monarchies that the French Revolution had unseated. So even before they began, they put Louis XVIII back on the throne. Later, they restored legitimate monarchs in Portugal, Spain, and the Italian states. So they're getting rid of the people that Napoleon had put on the thrones and restoring the people who had hereditary right, so right through their parents. But to protect the new order, they extend their wartime alliance into the post-war era, this quadruple alliance of Austria, Russia, Prussia, and Great Britain. They pledged to act together, maintain the balance of power, and mostly stop France from doing what they had just done again. But another result was a system known as the Concert of Europe, in which the powers met periodically to discuss problems affecting peace in Europe. They achieved their immediate goals. Their decisions influenced European politics for the next 100 years. And they wouldn't see war on that scale for another 100 years until World War I. But they failed to see how powerful new forces such as nationalism would shake the foundations again in the coming decades. So that's the end of that. Hope you've enjoyed, hope you learned something. Napoleon came shockingly close to taking over the entire world in the early 1800s. He attacked everywhere that he possibly could, and quite frankly, the world would have looked a lot different if he had won just a few other different major battles. All right, so that's the Age of Napoleon. It's also the end of chapter 18, so we'll go over what happens next later today. I'll talk to you guys soon. Hope you're well, and happy May. Bye.